Chapter 22 is about the early 20th century. And so the Western views of reality changed pretty radically at the turn of the century. As you remember, we've had the Industrial Revolution that has completely changed how we live. Around 1900, Sigmund Freud published The Interpretations of Dreams. And so now we have this power and influence of the subconscious mind that we weren't aware of before. In 1903, the Wright brothers flew their first power aircraft. And in 1905, Albert Einstein developed his theory of relativity, which changed the concept of time, space, and substance by determining that matter is no longer considered a solid, but a form of energy. And so how we live, how we think, drastically changes at the turn of the century. And so obviously our art is going to change also drastically. We're going to look at three movements during this time period of the early 20th century: the Fauves, Expressionism, and Cubism. The Fauves actually studied post-impressionists such as Cezanne, Van Gogh, and Gauguin. They were interested in how these artists took impressionism and made them more expressive and more emotional. And so they're known for their vigorous brushstroke and these large flat areas of expressive color, as you see in this painting here. The first exhibit was pretty shocking to the public, and an art critic called them the wild beasts, les fauves, which is the name they took on as themselves. So it was known as the Fauves, or the Fauvism movement. And so Matisse was one of the leaders of this movement, and this is his painting, The Joy of Life. And he was not intending to necessarily be rebellious. He simply wanted to express life using line, color, subject, and composition, which now seems pretty simple to us, but was pretty new and revolutionary for this time. And so in this painting here we see these pure and vibrant hues, a lot of non-descriptive lines. It's just in the trees and even in the figures. They're very expressive lines, not necessarily descriptive. And so this was based on his own knowledge of anatomy. He's not looking at anything to study this, and so we see a lot of simplified shapes. And it's supposed to be very direct and childlike. That's the quality he wanted to create. He wanted it to be very joyful, much like a child. And so he's being very expressive with this painting. And so this movement only lasted for a couple of years at the turn of the century, but it was very influential because it actually freed color from the traditional role of describing the natural appearance of something. Color can now be very independent in this expressive element that we can use in art. So this leads us into Expressionism. Expressionism comes out of Fauvism, but Expressionism is kind of this umbrella term for art that emphasizes emotion rather than over depicting what we see. And so we start to see during Expressionism art evolving toward an absence of representational object, where the subject kind of becomes secondary, and we start to see the development of non-representational art. So here's another one of Kandinsky's paintings. And he was an expressionist painter. And in 1910, he overturned an important rule of Western art. He shifted to totally non-representational imagery to concentrate on the expressive potential of pure form. And so he wanted to create artwork that was freed from association with recognizable objects. And so he believed that art is a response to your inner soul, and you do not need a picture to create this response to your inner soul. And so he compared it to sound language, to this experience we have when listening to music, how music could make us feel different emotions or bring back memories or make us think different thoughts, but there's no picture being seen. And so that's what he's trying to depict here with Composition 4. Many of these paintings during this series were had musical titles such as this, such as a composition can be an artistic term for visual arts or for music. And so Kandinsky is pretty key in developing non-representational art that we're going to see is a huge influence on art history from this time period forward, and has really challenged artists ever since his kind of shift to pure non-representational art. Kandinsky was once quoted as saying that abstract art could provide spiritual nourishment for the modern world, and it definitely does affect the modern world still today. Another innovation during this time period, remember this is just the early 20th century, so this is a lot going on at one time, but developed by Picasso and Baroque is Cubism. And it was actually developed to kind of recreate the pictorial composition. And he was influenced by Cézanne's reconstructions of nature. Remember we saw that last chapter in that post-impressionist piece where he broke up the nature into these geometric brushstrokes. And he was also influenced by African sculptures, as you see here on both of the sides of this image. But basically what they were trying to do was kind of develop a new way of depicting space. And so how they would do this is they would analyze subject from different angles. So for example, in this painting it was women. And then they would paint them in these abstract geometric references to these angles. And so it's based on how the mind sees things. It's based, rather than how we just kind of perceive how things should be. And so it's a little confusing and maybe hard to understand. The best way I know about maybe explaining it is how when you look in a mirror or see a photograph of yourself, you're just seeing yourself on this flat plane. You know, you never, unless it's in a video of course, but you don't see yourself three-dimensionally. And so what you see in the mirror is very different than what I would see if I were talking to you, because I would be able to see, you know, the side of your nose, the side of your ear, maybe under your chin, maybe the back of your head when you turned your head when you were talking. And so it's a much different experience than looking at something flat, like in a picture or a mirror. And so that's what they were trying to depict, all these different sides and all these different angles that your eye actually sees at one time and your mind perceives it as a whole head. Maybe that kind of makes a little bit more sense. And so basically they reinvented pictorial space. And so this is kind of a counterpart to the Expressionist. It's not based on emotion, it's just very straightforward pictorial composition. And so we see this painting here by Picasso. We see a lot of fractured angular figures. A lot of sharp triangles are used. And the entire picture frame is being activated. And so that's very common with these Cubist pieces, where we kind of have this merging of the figure and the ground. It kind of looks like all the forms are piled up and kind of rushing to the front of the picture plane. So here's an image of Picasso. You can see him in his studio here with a lot of his paintings. Picasso lived a very long and influential life in the art world. He was influential in many different art movements other than Cubism. So here's another one of his pieces, Factory. And so as you can see, it's this factory, but it's being broken up into these different angles and shapes. And so on the left, we can kind of see that still looks like a building, but as we move towards the right, the shapes get a little blurred and you can't tell what's figure and ground or what's really going on. And that's fine. It's not about necessarily knowing what you're looking at when it's done. You can kind of approach it more of like a study or a practice of how we see and being able to understand how we see a little better. So here's another one of his still lifes. It's the mandolin and guitar. And so it's done in the cubist form. You can see with the mandolin and the guitar, the sides of the guitar are almost filleted up, where they look like they're sitting beside the top, and even on the neck of the guitar. And so we're kind of seeing all the different angles of these images at one time. And then here's a portrait, Weeping Woman. And so you can see here, once again, the entire picture plane is activated. We have this bold outline of these abstract shapes, and you can see it gets pretty intense with the shapes when her hands are brought up to her mouth and the teeth. And so everything is broken up into these geometric planes.